When I was in the first couple of years of elementary school, back in the day about 1,000,000 years ago, it seems like we spent a fair amount of time coloring pre-drawn pictures of all kinds. Now, a lot of my classmates were really, really good at this. They colored some really beautiful pictures to hang on the walls around the room and then to take home and put on the family refrigerator. As for me, I wasn't particularly good at this, nor did I find it especially enjoyable. I tried the suggestion of beginning by tracing bold, colorful lines around the lines that were already drawn in the picture in an attempt to boundary my coloring, but that didn't work very well either. This task in and of itself seemed pretty meaningless to me. It didn't always keep me inside the lines, and in the end, the finished product with these bold lines standing out really didn't look that great anyhow. And I always kind of had this unarticulated question inside of me: why is it so important anyway to color inside the lines exactly the way someone else drew the picture? Now, coloring outside the lines isn't always a good thing to do, of course, or even necessarily helpful in every situation. But then again, coloring inside the lines isn't really all it's cracked up to be either. This morning's readings find Jesus coloring outside the lines, deviating rather significantly from the rules clearly established and set in place for years and years, rules and traditions to be followed by the truly religious person. Now, Jesus certainly knew the rules. He was well versed in Jewish tradition and law. Jesus could not possibly have breached religious protocol out of ignorance of the law, nor allowed or even encouraged those who followed him to step outside the bounds of the rules without knowing very clearly what he was doing and that there would be a price to pay. So it's really no surprise when the disciples do what is forbidden on the Sabbath, picking some grain in order to satisfy their hunger, that Jesus is reprimanded, though we might be surprised by Jesus' apparent defiance and blatant disregard for the laws of his tradition. Jesus tells the religious authorities, if you really knew what Scripture means when it says, I desire compassion and not sacrifices, if you really understood compassion in the true spiritual sense in the heart of your being, if you really were living a life of compassion, you wouldn't be condemning innocent people in need. And then Jesus went on to say, I am the ruler of the Sabbath. Needless to say, this did not win Jesus any brownie points with either the religious establishment and most especially with key religious leaders. Not to be deterred from the mission God has placed before him, Jesus goes to the neighborhood synagogue, where the seeds of a plot to destroy Jesus already are beginning to take root. And there, sitting in the synagogue, is a person, as the text says, with a withered hand, in an attempt to trap Jesus. Religious leaders ask, so, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Not mincing words, Jesus tells them, suppose you have only one sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Would you not grab it and lift it out? Certainly, this person is worth more than a sheep. So yes, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Topping off this encounter, Jesus says to the person in need of healing, stretch out your hand. And immediately, the hand is restored. As for Jesus, he's getting closer and closer to sealing his fate as he continues ushering in the new reign of God, and the Pharisees begin planning how to destroy him. Fully aware of what is going on, Jesus left the area, at least for now. Sometimes we have to color outside the lines, even breaking the rules established by someone at some time in order to do the right thing. When I was in seminary, I had Dr. Ed Dowie for 2 courses, both semester-long courses, Calvin's Institutes, where we went through all of Calvin's Institutes, and the history and theology of Presbyterianism. Ed Dowie was on the committee who wrote the Confession of 1967, which is in our Constitution. In fact, he was the one who set the structure for the entire confession. When the group was floundering with papers all over the place, he sent them out to dinner for a while, and then he began to cut and paste. So when the group reconvened, they basically had what we now know as the Confession of 1967. In my mind, after probably not even both full semesters, Ed Dowie was Mr. Presbyterian incarnate. So one day, well into the semester, one of my classmates asked Ed Dowie, if he were a pastor in a church and he were called to a hospital by a young couple who had just had a baby because, to their devastating surprise, something had gone horribly wrong and the newborn had only minutes to live, and they wanted the baby baptized so their child would go to heaven, what would he do? In his stern, firm, how could you possibly not know the answer to this question at this point in the semester voice, Ed Dowie began to explain yet again how baptism indeed is a means of grace, but not the only means of grace. That baptism is always a community experience to be done in the gathered congregation. Private baptism is not acceptable. It is not the act of baptism that saves us. Baptism is not necessary in order to spend eternity with God. An unbaptized baby is not going to go to hell. To baptize a baby under these circumstances would go against a reformed understanding of baptism and promote really bad theology. Thinking the answer had been given, the student, indeed the entire class, were taken aback when Mr. Presbyterian himself nearly bellowed at us, "Of course you would baptize the baby. You are their pastor. What else could you possibly do?" And then he proceeded with the lecture for the day. Little did I know how helpful that experience would be not so terribly long into my ministry. So following the compassionate Jesus may require us to color outside the lines if the picture is going to turn out the way it should, the way God intends. Some years later, I took an ethics course for my Doctor of Ministry program with Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, the first African-American woman ordained as minister of word and sacrament in our denomination. We spent the first couple of days out in Berkeley with this 2-week intensive course, reading and talking about normative ethics, the kind of things that many of us have heard in our ethics courses, getting us regrounded in basic traditional formal ethics concepts. Then we shifted. The rest of the 2 weeks was spent reading really good literature written by African American women, while we examined ethical situations and choices, being challenged to re-examine our own ethical norms, and becoming grounded in the realization that ethics taught only from the perspective of dominant culture is not the only approach, does not necessarily lead to ethical choices, and may indeed be unethical, perpetuating and expanding injustice in our society and in our world. All of this was interspersed with real-life experiences of everyone in the class, sometimes opening our eyes to things we had not seen before, other times giving voice to what we